Hello. Hello, everybody. My jingle and my font and everything are still out of date. So it's another fortnight of not updating my media. But if you're new here, you won't know that. So you might be wondering what on earth I'm going on about. But my name's Natalie. I run a club called the Curious Descendants Club, which is all about writing your family history. And I think to really get to know your ancestors, you have to cast the net wide and get to know much about all different types of history as possible. And so today I am joined by Justin, who I will let introduce yourself to talk all about queer history. So hi, Justin.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you for coming. Um, so I'm really excited to get stuck in, but I don't really want to tell people where you're from and what you do, just so they know who you are.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I'm coming to you live from New Cross here in London. I'm lecturer in queer history at Goldsmiths, University of London, where I also convene the MA Queer History, which is the only queer history master's degree in the world. So my work is entirely focused on researching and teaching and telling the LGBTQ past.
Brilliant. Thank you. See, this is why I always ask guests to introduce themselves, because I know if I do it, I will not do it justice at all. So thank you. If you're listening and you'd like to comment with any questions, please do feel free. Okay, so just starting right at the very beginning, what exactly is queer history and what do we mean when we use the word queer?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question right off the bat. I mean, and even that word queer is something that is always worth reflecting on. And because for many people, the word queer is still a really offensive term and one that they experienced as a term of violence, that they might have experienced homophobic violence and with kicks and punches heard that word used against them. So a lot of people or some people can be surprised that we're using it now and that we're using it in a university course. Legally, my title is lecturer in queer history and the degree is queer history. And that's also for a very deliberate reason. That ever since the 80s, really, both grassroots people that might identify as queer or might identify under other elements of LGBTQ plusness have tried to reclaim the word and take the venom out of it and use it as a term of self-description that speaks to them and resonates differently than, say, lesbian or gay or bi did for them in the past. As academics, we use it as both an umbrella to capture LGBTQIA plus and whatever else we might add to that, as a way of recognizing the incredible diversity in our community today, and also that some people, like I said, identify as queer, and it's important to recognize that some people do. We also recognize that history of violence and danger in the past, and also that before that there were people that identified as queer sometimes. I've seen letters from the 1930s in which a man described himself as queer in a way that resonates, at least, with our understandings today. But for historians, it's also really important because we would argue, as queer historians, that we're not just looking for LGBT people in the past, that actually in the past people aren't exactly like us. And to call them exactly the same thing, actually, as much as it might satisfy us to find our ancestors, it kind of denies them some of their life and denies them some of the specificity of the world that they lived in and the way they understood their lives. And so we try, at least, to acknowledge that people in the 1800s, the 1600s, the 400s, who might experience same-sex desire or gender non-conforming behavior, aren't exactly like us today. And queer tries to get us to think about that we're not just finding, and me as a gay man in 2022, I'm not just finding, oh, here's another gay man in 1830. He's actually quite different from me, even if we have similarities.
I think it's really interesting, actually. I was reflecting earlier on the word queer because I think growing up, I thought of it as sometimes used as a slur, but also just a word to kind of mean somebody's a bit odd or a bit different, which in itself could be insulting or not, depending on your viewpoint. And then I was thinking about kind of the use of it in popular culture, and my first memory of it being used is probably queer as folk, and that
Mm.
it kind of exploding onto the scenes in that kind of 90s. So
Yeah,
it is definitely got a really interesting history itself as a word, I think. So thank
yeah.
you for that explanation.
Well, you're absolutely right about those points too, about that meaning of the word as being a bit strange or different. Because how many of us want to just be normal these days anyway? It's
Certainly not
kind of,
me.
yes, and then some of us, however much we might try, we're not going to succeed.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry, just noticing that all of my cables have gone in a tangle around my head. But no, yeah, there's no such thing as normal, is there? I think when you're younger, you can spend, or certainly I did. I think in my teen years, spend all this time trying to fit in and be normal, and then as you get older, you realise that nobody's normal, and it's
Mm,
really quite freeing, and you kind of hopefully find your tribe of people. In my case, people who like talking about history nonstop and who don't think I'm a complete geek, or think I'm a complete geek and don't care. So, but whatever your thing is. So yeah, no, I agree. Okay, so it's interesting that you were saying about looking at somebody in the past who might be queer, and obviously them not necessarily fitting into kind of a neat box of how we might define somebody today as gay. So with that being the case, how do you go back and look at the past and look for those clues about whether somebody might be queer and kind of find those stories? Especially ones, especially obviously there are cases where people were criminalized, and
mm.
obviously that gives you more uh, sad, but also gives you the evidence, I suppose. But if that isn't the case, how do you kind of go about digging up those stories and looking for queerness in the past?
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good question too, because I mean, how do we look for something that has been so often deliberately obscured in the
Yeah,
past, either by the state, by officials, by whomever that wants to potentially erase that history, or people themselves that want to protect themselves and want to have safety and security and don't want that to be found out. So in addition to, yeah, you might find that there's trial records, court records, someone's been charged with offenses that give you an indication that they fell foul of the law for homosexual offenses in places where that was illegal. Of course, that generally is going to privilege men's lives and men's stories rather than women's, because at least in the UK, homosexual acts between men were illegal, but homosexual acts between women were not. So already, if you're only looking at legal and court records, you're for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, going to neglect the lives of lesbians and women who desired other women. Um, Again, looking to classic family history sources, family papers, documents, letters, relationships being shown in these kinds of documents. But then sometimes you need to be able to discern the codes that are in there, because it's not necessarily going to be the case that great Aunt Elma is writing a letter in the 1920s saying to my dearest Edna, I've missed you so much and I love you and I wish we could be truthful about this. It's never going to be, or I shouldn't say never. There's these amazing cases sometimes where gold dust appears,
yeah, that's
but
rare.
um, but that's rare. I mean, it's more about looking between the lines, looking for suggestions, looking for silences and what those might mean. Um, I suppose there's always that kind of stereotype of the bachelor uncle and the spinster aunt. And I mean, that could be something to look further into. Of course, it's not um, definitive by any stretch, but people that lived outside of the norms of their time might also be relevant for looking into our family's queer histories. But we shouldn't just assume that if someone was single all their lives, they were just getting up to something that wasn't legal, because there's not much stopping married couples, heterosexually married couples, from also having relationships external to that with members of the same sex. Or within those relationships, the partner might know and they might have an understanding and it might be understood. And I've spoken to a number of people that were in opposite sex marriages in the 1940s, 1950s. So certainly that period in which we think this was not spoken about, people wouldn't have known. They tell me their partner knew, and this was the terms of their relationship. Whether that was successful, whether that was not, I mean, that's particular to their relationship, but it was known, and they might have kept it from wider families, but that couple had reasons for undertaking the relationship that they did.
Yeah, I think sometimes we underestimate how transactional marriages can be as well, and how they as much as we want them to be about love, they can also be about a whole host of different things, especially in the past.
Uh,
That was, yeah. So no, it's really interesting. Funny enough, we were having a discussion on Twitter a really great family historian, was asking about finding married couples that were childless, and the kind of dangers of assuming why, but also not wanting to ignore it. So it makes for a really interesting conversation, I think, of ethical dilemmas, but also trying to dig deeper for those extra little details that might give you clues.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, in the cases where you have found evidence of queer pasts, and I know I'm thinking of your postcards here to give you a hint, because I know we drafted these questions a long time ago. What kind of evidence do you find that might suggest, more concretely suggest queerness in the past?
Yeah, so this is a really exciting topic for me because it's a new area of research that I'm exploring. I suppose I've been interested, maybe I should back it up a little bit. I've been interested in family history for a long time. My paternal family is all Mormon. So there's all kinds of interest in family history and genealogy that I just grew up around. And this taken for grantedness that you'd want to know your family tree and everybody back and fill that in and know about everybody. And then I suppose the little baby budding historian in me as a kid gravitated toward that as a kind of accessible history that I could learn about my own family, their migration patterns, who did what, how they, all of these things. And we have all these different family stories. So I've always been interested in family histories, I think. And now it's just recently in the last year or so that I've really started thinking about it in terms of my professional work in queer history. And that's when we first encountered each other, was when I was starting to explore, how do you get insights into this and how do you find these? And one area that I started looking at was postcards, as you mentioned. And I started buying postcards online that either twigged my queer spidey sense, or with a little bit of digging, I knew ahead of time that there was something to that. And the wonderful thing is with postcards is you're likely to have someone's name and you have an address for sure. And so with the census records, for instance, and electoral rolls and everything else, you can start finding households based on that information. And so what I did with one postcard that I found quite early, this was one that was, I'm at Goldsmiths now rather at home, otherwise I would pull it out, but imagine the scene. It's the postcard is along the embankment here in London. It's a dark night, it's a bit foggy, you can just see the silhouettes of trees. You see one man and then facing another man who is a police officer. He's got a sort of Bobby's hat on. And I thought, this is suggestive to me. It was just a nighttime London scene. It was sold commercially. So you could have bought it for any number of reasons. You could have bought that to send back to Aunt Elma if you wanted to. But it also, I looked at it, I'm like, I think this postcard would resonate with queer men. The postcard was from the 1920s. And I'm like, I think this would resonate because there was that sense of furtiveness in the dark, the danger of the police officer stopping you, arresting you for what they would have called soliciting and importuning if you were trying to meet other men. And often along the river, there were particular walks that were known as useful for queer men at the time. There's just a whole bunch of suggestions in the image that said to me, I think this might be useful. And the other side, it was the postcard was written from one man to, I think, just initials and then the address in Birmingham, I think it was. And it was basically him going on about how awful the theater was in London. And this play was, it was very campy and prissy. And I'm like, okay, well, sometimes stereotypes are to case. And I thought, this is now double confirming what I thought. And when I went to the various family history databases and sites and brought up information about the address, I saw that at that address were two men. And so there just starts being this overwhelming snowball of evidence that I've got a postcard that has imagery that is resonant for queer men at the time. I've got text that's about this kind of theatery world in the West End in the 1920s. And then I've got a household that only has two men living in it. Yeah. It's all starting to come together. And I haven't dug up much more into the men involved. I think one of them ended up actually being, I found out he was significant in theater, and I think was one of the founders of the Malvern Festival. So was actually, and I think what it was then, one of them I confirmed later in life. It was confirmed he was gay.
Okay.
So all my queer spidey sense was right.
Okay, that was bang on. I love that. So symbols are really interesting actually when you were describing the image on the front of the a postcard, because I'm guessing if some things had to be kept secret for fear of if not criminality, of fear of being socially unaccepted, then over time different ways of communicating subvertly must have been created in order to find people that were like yourself.
Exactly.
um so what kind of, is there any, so I was thinking, is it violets are a symbol of, is that a
Oh,
symbol of
there's
lesbianism?
different
Is
flowers.
it?
I mean, I
Yeah.
suppose I wonder if like, I mean, the classic one is the green carnation. Uh,
Okay, I've never heard of that.
that goes back to Wilde, well, Oscar Wilde, I understand. I think pansies are always kind of playful.
Okay. Yeah.
The violet, maybe. I'd have to look into some of that. I was going to say, some of the other ones that I'm looking for in the postcards are, again, those that kind of nighttime scene that sort of suggests danger and possibility. Guardsmen.
Okay.
And I mean, today you can buy loads of postcards with guardsmen on them, the sort of big bear cap type that are out in front of Buckingham Palace.
Yeah.
But the guardsmen were known for much of the 20th century to dabble in sex work with other men. So they
Oh,
were
really?
eroticized. They were definitely on the. They were commercially available, and so I've started looking for postcards of guardsmen written by men to other men as another way into possible examples.
That's fascinating. That just makes me think of like almost the equivalent of buying like a YMCA, the
Yeah,
old song
yeah,
with the guys from the YMCA song like on the front of it now, almost,
yeah, yeah.
like a flag.
And and then for earlier ones, I've been looking at a lot of. There's a few, especially earlier 20th, late 19th century, male impersonators, and I'm looking. I want to look into the stories of the women who wrote to other women using these pictures of Vesta Tilley or Hetty King, famous male impersonators on the music hall stage, that were. I mean, there's queer codings there in terms of cross-dressing, gender crossing. They weren't necessarily always queer themselves, but they could be useful as symbols. And again, the postcards give an opportunity to explore that. And it's not always. It's not okay. We've got one woman writing to another woman on this postcard with a male impersonator. Well, clearly they're lesbians. That's not the case at all. But it opens up that possibility that we might be able to read between the lines and follow more. And there's going to be loads of dead ends, but some possibilities. So this also goes to say, in terms of with your own family histories and whatnot, with the records that might be passed down to you, it's not sort of see what you can find on the internet and dig for people. You might actually have some of these in your own family that have been passed down with someone's papers. They might have some of these postcards, and you might ask, why was Aunt Elma getting all of these male impersonator postcards? Maybe there's a story. Maybe there's not a story there, but maybe there is.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I guess, yeah, it's difficult because I was just thinking about women impersonating men then, and I was just thinking, in the past it's difficult because you might decide to cross dress for queer reasons, but you also might decide to cross dress because you feel like you have more opportunity as a man, and if you can disguise your gender because you want to do something in particular. So it's really difficult to kind of decode. And I suppose when you find these kind of clues, do you tend to err on the side of caution and kind of say this could indicate, or I think I'm like 80% sure, but I haven't got that final cherry on the cake, so I can still write about it and still say this might be the case and still explore that, but I don't kind of go out and say yes, this is definite. Do you kind of draw your own kind of percentages boundaries, if you know what I mean? So I know I do with family history. I look at things and I think, right, I'm going to say this because I'm more than 60% sure, but I'm going to make sure I really caveat it in, this is what I know, and these are the bits that are missing that I wish I knew that I can't
Yeah.
answer. And I'm guessing it would be the same for any history, but
I think I probably tend to be quite cautious, and I think I'd also describe things to different audiences. So there's a difference between what I would say in a chat like this, say, I think so. This is
Yeah,
my
yeah.
hunch. I think so, versus what I would publish in an academic paper, and put a lot more caveats around it. But I'm also in many ways a very old-fashioned historian, that I want to have lots of different kinds of evidence from different kinds of sources that help support that. Very often with queer history, you'll never find that. You're lucky to get just one little nugget somewhere. But I do, in some cases, try to research around someone. So in several cases, actually, I have, well, in one case, I found a trial records at the National Archives from the 1930s, in which a man was found innocent. But there was so much evidence and so much, I mean, the trial itself just made me feel a bit, there's more to this story. And ultimately it was that a younger man that he was accused of having sex with was convicted for other offenses himself, as being a sort of corrupt, delinquent youth. And the wealthy, well-to-do, military-affiliated gentleman couldn't possibly be guilty. In the end, that trial that was in 1933, I found the family. And the family subsequently shared all of their family records with me. His letters, so actually during the trial, a lot of his letters to his wife were confiscated and put in the trial records that are still at the National Archives. So I was able to fill in the family with the letters they don't have, and they were able to fill out the ones I hadn't seen that remained with the family from the rest of his life. He died just a few years later of natural causes. Annoyingly, his stepdaughter was still alive when I first found the family, but passed away before I could meet her. And she was the last living person that would have known him in person. But what I learned by talking to the family is they're like, oh yeah, we knew about the trial. We didn't know about the files at the National Archives, but we knew about the trial. We knew about his relationship with our grandmother. This was something that was shared knowledge in our family. Oh, and of course he was guilty. So in that case, I've got the family saying, oh, well, this found him innocent, but we know better than that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I am, yeah, that's gold dust, that kind of thing. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things that you just reminded me of is that there was a set of photos that went quite viral, and I think they were mostly kind of World War One-ish kind of era, and they were supposedly of all queer people, but some of them were, seemed quite obviously queer, like men kissing, but and these were mostly men as well in these photographs, but some of them were, a man sat on another man's lap, or some people with their arms around each other. And I know when I mentioned it to you in our pre-chat, you were telling me about how you kind of have to be careful with those kind of sources, because what we might view as affectionate and tactile might be different in the past, or people in the past might be more tactile, and we might be less, or vice versa. And I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about
Yeah,
that.
I mean, that's been such an interesting collection, because what's it called? Is it called Men Loving or something like that? It's a book.
Something like that. So it's an amazing collection.
Yeah, oh, it
It's
is.
interesting.
Amazing collection. There's so many incredible, valuable to our history images in that book, and clearly they resonate with. I mean, it's all images of men, if I remember correctly. So obviously, this is a book that resonates powerfully with gay men, and it's been all over. It was all over the gay press last year, and of course, everybody loves it. As a historian, well, I've got two hats that I'm wearing on this one. As a gay man, I see these images and they really speak to me, and they go right here, and they really resonate. And I see myself in these images from the past, and I can imagine myself in those situations. But then I put my historian hat on, and I'm like, well, some of these no doubt were men that were in intimate relationships, or maybe just in casual relationships. I mean, why does everything have to be loving? Why can't it just be physical gratification? People were horny in the past too, and sometimes that's the answer. But we should be thinking about what you just said, what physical proximity, physical intimacy of various types of arm around someone, what appears to be embracing, what does that mean? We don't know if these people are lovers, long-term, workmates, siblings, other relatives, anything. And no doubt some of them are. Some of them are going to be just playfully horsing around, and that's the picture. There was one I remember seeing, I should have, I want to bring it to my students one day, that shows two men in sort of grass, kind of, it looks like one has got his arm over the other one, their legs are entwined, and it looks like this really not quite sexual, but very intimate, powerful embrace. And it's so touching. And then the next picture is that not being zoomed in. And it's captioned from like 1910 that this was at a boxing competition and they'd fallen to the ground and were wrestling in the dirt. And it's, as soon as you see that, it's so clearly wrestling in the dirt. But before you see the full image, it's this powerful expression of love.
But surely that must tell us something about ourselves, I guess, or about the people that took the photo and cropped it, and the people who shared
Totally.
it and things. So that's it. I guess it's interesting in itself.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think that book with all these pictures of what are presented as gay men in the past tell us way more about ourselves today than about any of those men in those images. I mean, that's just one example that is challenging. Other times we might say, well, if these are commercially produced photographs, and some of them are going to be like, you've seen the images where they're from a photographer's studio and it's on cardboard and it's got the maker's stuff on the back. If homosexuality is illegal and punishable by minimum 2 years imprisonment, punishable by death until 1861, these guys are not going to walk down to the high street and have their canoodling pictures taken. It's just not going to happen. There's an argument for snapshots and later when you can have develop your own photographs, that some of that would be doing it, or the amazing pictures in automatic photography booths where no one has to process it, no one else is going to see it. You just get the picture and then you go. And there's amazing, completely verifiable pictures of male couples from the 50s and 60s. With those kinds of images. And I find those really powerful. So this isn't to sort of rain on everybody's parade that these older images can't possibly be of queer couples. It's just to say, maybe they are. And I dearly hope that many of them are, because it means so much to me, and many of them won't be.
Yeah. It's interesting. I guess, yeah. It's funny, it reminds me of when I was a young teenager. My parents took me on holiday to Italy, and I grew up in a household where my mum had gay friends. In fact, my mum had a cross-dresser friend, so I was quite was used to seeing people holding hands and things stuff. But went to Italy, and I remember turning around to my mum and saying, "There's quite a lot of gay people in Italy." My mum going, "No, that's just men holding hands because they're friends, and we're on the continent, and things are a bit different, sort of thing." So I guess it's a similar kind of thing,
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. We should remember the past is a different country.
Yeah. I just wish I could visit.
Yeah. Well, we can get glimpses, can't
Yeah.
we?
Yeah. Okay. So I know that you've got a particular interest in kind of late and 20th century queer history, and I just wondered, why is that? Why is that period the period that kind of grabs you?
That's an interesting question, because I started my undergraduate studies looking at ancient history, and for some reason, and I'd been fascinated with that as a kid. I wanted to know all about ancient Greece and Rome, ancient Egypt, and goodness knows there's plenty of queer history there that I would have found once I kind of matured into my full historian self. But then something, I guess, clicked with my classes as an undergraduate in Canada. I just got more interested in Victorian and 20th century histories, and I've stayed with that ever since. And I suppose it's also just the kinds of sources are really interesting to me. And I suppose my area of specific research is actually histories of capitalism and homosexuality. I've been working on a project for 73 years, it feels like, a prehistory of the pink pound. And so that really is very much a late 19th and 20th century phenomenon. So I've gravitated toward that. And I suppose I did business studies even as an undergraduate. So I'm interested in advertising and marketing and all of these things. So I just got pulled into the 20th century.
So what's the pink pound?
Oh, that's another. I can give a talk on that for an hour.
Sorry.
Well, I'm really interested in finding out how businesses grappled with the topic of homosexuality, queerness, LGBTQness, how they tried to speak to or identify queer consumers in the past, long before the period of gay liberation, long before the 70s and 80s, when this could be done more openly, and how they profited from discussions of homosexuality and queerness, either with supportive, progressive materials in magazines and books, what have you, but also homophobia and how that can be a saleable commodity. So I've tried to look at all these kinds of relationships between homosexuality and consumer capitalism and how anyone can profit from queer consumers or queerness more broadly.
That sounds really interesting. Do you compare that to today?
I take it up to, it's mostly 20th century. By the time we get to today, it gets really complex. But whenever I give talks, everybody wants to ask about pride, the commodification of pride, corporate sponsorship. And so I've been answering more and more of those questions. And fortunately, I did a business degree, so I talk about it. But there's times when I often say, like, I'm much more comfortable talking about dead people.
I'll line you up for interview number 2.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just reading from my list, so it's a little bit of a jump now. But the next question on my list happens to be, and I think it's a really interesting one, even though it's probably a little bit of a break in the flow to a certain degree, is how has queerness been accommodated into normative structures?
Well, that actually does relate to some of what we were talking about when I said that we shouldn't just be looking for lesbian and gay, trans, bi people in the past. We should think about how other people's lives are different from our own. So there's been really amazing research done by, well, scholars in the States, here in the UK. There's a great scholar called Helen Smith, who is, I'm trying to remember, she is, I was going to say Sheffield. She's based there, but I think she's at Lincoln. I'm pretty sure she's at Lincoln. I need to have my notes here.
We'll find her. We'll put her on the blog.
Exactly. Put Helen Smith on the blog. She's done amazing research that's looked into the industrial workplaces of Yorkshire in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and really looked at how men who were working there, could be married, could have kids, were ostensibly straight, were having sex with coworkers at work, on work trips, in the mines, in the steel mills. Not just that this was happening, because you might say, okay, Justin, sure, there's always examples of homosexual activity, and we often know that because of trials and things. What Helen found, and I've been really influenced by this, was that these were accommodated by their families and by their communities. That these were part of normal heterosexuality at this time. And so long as these men demonstrated that they were of good character, good earners, contributors to their family, this didn't have to disrupt those lives. And their wives might know about it, their communities might know about it, but if they weren't going to leave their wives to go off with some other guy, and he wasn't going to get pregnant. So actually, as long as they didn't disrupt the stability of the home, the family, and the community, this activity could be accommodated within these communities. And I think what it should tell us is probably what Helen found in Yorkshire, as much as there hasn't been a lot of work on this, is probably not impossible, out of the ordinary in a lot of other places. And I think we have to think about a lot more hetero flexibility in the past, that people's sexuality could be more fluid before we had this really strict binary that you're gay or you're straight. And maybe that makes more sense to us now as younger people are identifying their sexuality and gender identity in more fluid ways. People like me, I'm 45 very soon. For me, my gender identity and sexuality is really binary. That's just what makes sense to me. And I think my students, in a lot of ways, have a lot more in common with these people from 70, 80 years ago than I do. And it's really interesting. So I think while there's people that are my age and a bit older that might resist some of these histories, my students they're like, yeah, tell us something we didn't know, Justin.
It's interesting. I guess that comes back to sort of what makes somebody, what for want of a better word, what gives somebody the label of being a certain thing, or a certain sexuality, or a certain gender.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
if it's predetermined, if it's you that's determining it, then I guess that allows for that fluidity much more, doesn't it? It's when it's kind of boxed upon by other people going, okay, you tick this and this and this list, and therefore you must equal, you
Mhm.
must equal X.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well, and the other thing to bear in mind with this case, with these cases in the North, many of these guys would have known what a homosexual was. They would have read in the papers about trials, but they would have been, that's someone else. That's someone from London. That's a city thing. Or that's those effeminate guys, those pansies in other places. Not real men that are working class and working hard and supporting their families. Of course, I'm not homosexual. I'm not, yeah, one of those London types that does this.
in that case, then, what do you think do we know at all what they would have called it, or what they would have described what was going on as, or would they not even have felt a need to do that?
I don't think they would have felt the need to do that. I think they would have just been like, yeah, I mean, if they probably wouldn't have talked about it much for one thing. And if they did, they're just like, they would see themselves as just letting off steam, getting some relief. That's not to say there wasn't emotional investment in it as well, and that there couldn't be emotional relationships, but they would have seen that they might not have named it. They might not have felt the need to name and label it. And in fact, it would have been defined by not being these other things that were labeled. And some of them, then they didn't realize that what they were doing was illegal. They didn't realize because illegal was something that the homosexuals did. So what they're doing couldn't possibly be. And some of them got a surprise when the law felt differently. And that's how we have records of some of them. And in some of those trials and some of those cases, we see in their testimony that they don't see that connection. And for them, it was something different.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So actually, that kind of leads me on to a kind of linked question, I suppose, is kind of in Western cultures, how has kind of prejudice changed over time, or tolerance changed over time then? So if you've got these kind of pockets of tolerance, even though if it's not named, yeah, it's difficult, but I kind of wonder how that's shifted over time and
Yeah.
perhaps is still shifting.
That's an interesting thing, because if it's accommodated with within a community, because the systems of knowledge and understanding are different, is that tolerance? Arguably, it's something better than tolerance. It's just integration of different ways of living and being. But those places could also be places of vicious homophobia. When the person is named and identified as that, they might not be met with support. So I think these understandings of tolerance, of homophobia, of acceptance, they're shifting over time, and they're on this kind of uncertain terrain, because who's being spoken about? It's more than just who you have sex with. It's also about gender presentation. Are you conventionally masculine? Are you effeminate? Are you cross-dressing? Are you possibly trans? All of these things come into play as well. What about the relative power you have economically? Can you get away well, like the guy that I told you about in that trial? One guy was well off, well connected, and was found innocent, even though the family doesn't believe he is. The younger man, who came from a rural family, was struggling to get by, was probably a casual sex worker, I think. He was found guilty, in part because he couldn't defend himself as well. He didn't have the language to do so, the connections to do so, the money to do so. He was, 23, 24. He was imprisoned, and he died in prison. He went in a healthy man, and he was dead before he was let out. That was something I remember finding that in the archive, that I was looking for what happened to the younger man for about a year. And I was tracing, again, through these family history websites and family history databases. His name was showing up in different places, but it was never the same person. In one instance, I found a man with the same name had a car dealership in the 40s or 50s in Shoreditch, and I'm like, and was married, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Here and I thought, this is going to be a great story. I've got this 1930s sex worker that later on is married and working his way up the social ladder in Shoreditch 15, 20 years later. But it wasn't the same guy. Followed someone else, dead ends, and then finally was able to get into the prison records, and found that he was dead within 18 months. And I suspect the victim of some kind of abuse in prison. I want to talk to scholars of imprisonment and incarceration to find out more, because I have the very summary results of the postmortem. And I don't know how to read those, because I think the terminology they're using is probably suggestive in ways that I don't understand, not being a historian of those questions and of medical histories. But it's something that I want to pursue further.
I'm really glad you said that, because I think family historians a lot of the time think I have to know everything. I have to like work this all out by myself, and I have to try and learn how to read certain historical documents and things. And I think it's really important that I love it when academics say, actually, I don't know this because I'm not a specialist in this, so I go to my colleague over here. And okay, it's harder when you're sat at home as a family historian to do that, but we have this amazing thing called Twitter, and so it's remarkably easier to reach out to people nowadays to ask those questions. So I just wanted to say I think that's a really important point.
Mm.
Bit unrelated to the subject, but I just think it's really important.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
No, and you're right. People shouldn't feel pressure to know everything about everything. I mean, even if some of us are an expert in one thing, there's many more things, even in history, that I know nothing about, than the area that I know lots about.
And I think because for family historians, because you look so broadly at things,
Mm.
and we find a death certificate and we do try to interpret it. You might, I don't know, go on to Wellcome Trust and look at old medical journal, try and suss it out yourself. And I think there's nothing wrong with doing that. I would carry on doing that myself as well. But I just think it's really worth remembering that you can also just ask for a bit of help,
Sure.
and that there are people out there willing to answer. So okay, so actually with crimes, is there, interestingly, I just wondered, is there are different people of different classes or different economical circumstances prosecuted for different things? Does there tend to be kind of class lines?
Um, hmm. Well, I mean, in that case, it was definitely a class differentiated. I was going to say couple. I mean, I wouldn't call them a couple, but the two people
Yeah.
were definitely on different class positions. I think what's interesting is when we look at, so the tabloids in the 1950s is an example of this. They were horrible, vicious, vitriolic, homophobic, terrible, in ways that destroyed and killed people, but they're amazing historical sources. And what they often did in these terrible chain trials, where they would basically bring loads of people through and say, get the address book of one and follow up and more. We have lists of people's names, but it'll give their name. It's mind-boggling. My students are always aghast when I show them these. They'll give the person's name, their age, their address, their profession. It's outing them to the world that they've been convicted in the national press. But by looking at their profession, we can get a sense of obviously some of the socioeconomic difference. And what we see is counter to, well, the stereotypes at the time were that homosexuality was this elite, effete predilection. And in fact, we see a lot of laborers, bakers, tradesmen, shop assistants, I mean, everybody. And I suppose I suppose closer research might show different crimes being charged against different classes of men in terms of who could defend themselves or who was more vulnerable. But what we see in some of this newspaper reportage is that there's actually quite a cross-section of society in many ways, and that it's quite representative, at least of those up to a certain point. That and beyond that, of course, you can find a way out. But the other thing, actually, as I'm speaking, what I'm realizing for male homosexual acts, many men were charged with soliciting and importuning, gross indecency in public places, things like that. And often that was because they didn't have the safety, security, and privacy of their own homes and lodgings or as a place to have sex with other men. So they would go to toilets, they would go to parks, whereas others, more affluent, would have the security of private homes, would have the possibility to bring someone home and not be in danger from someone stumbling upon them. But then you get to a point beyond that, because the guy actually that I was talking about at the beginning, that I've gone and met the family, he was found out because they had servants. So at the upper end of the social scale, you've got people that know everything that happens in your house, and you don't actually have that much privacy, even as you are really wealthy.
It's really interesting. Yeah, that's very much two ends of the spectrum there. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm just conscious we've got about 15 minutes left, so if anyone does have any questions, feel free to pop in. I know somebody just popped in and put tabloids haven't changed much then, and yeah, I just kind of agree. So, so we've got two questions really. One is, have you got a favourite story or favourite discovery that you'd like to share?
Well, I actually, I mean,
Not
originally,
that this was pre-planned at all.
well, it's funny actually, because originally when I was thinking about these questions, I thought I might tell that story of the man whose family I met. And in fact, what's good is I did bring with me actually one from my own family that works really well for this as well, and has intrigued me a lot. And is one that, again, it's my queer spidey sense was tingling, and I don't have an answer. But what I have is a cigarette tin, a North American cigarette tin that belonged to my great uncle Cecil. It was he died in the 70s, and his brother inherited everything. He was unmarried, and a cousin of mine, well, actually, like that's the Mormon side of the family, so it's like a third cousin, twice removed, something or other. But we've stayed in touch. His grandfather was like the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son. So he inherited stuff. I inherited nothing. But my cousin, who is himself gay as well, inherited this, and he thought, something's up here, because inside the tin is, well, a child's marble, so some kind of memento from Cecil's childhood. There's also some pictures of his siblings. I think this is 1915. One of his siblings that died as a child. Some other little frontier Canadian pictures, family pictures, things like that. But then there's a bunch of pictures of, you can't quite make it out, but there's pictures of men on the prairie on the frontier at the time. This is a school teacher. I've been able to trace him a little bit. He's from Nova Scotia, but he was a school teacher. So he was separated from his family, living singly. School teachers are kind of ambiguous characters, but it's not necessarily saying a lot. And then there's other ones, just says, these two villains, Woodruff and Bert. Okay, so there's a lot of gentleman friends. Someone else, here's Bert again. Don't know much about him. The teachers I actually thought were really interesting. Here's another tiny picture.
Oh, wow.
Another guy that was a local school teacher, probably just 20-something, first job out west, away from his family, alone. Amongst these, so we're already thinking, okay, Cecil, you've got some family pictures and a lot of gentleman friends for a confirmed bachelor. And then there was this, an image that I call the sultry Mountie. An RCMP officer taken maybe on the coast in Canada. It looks like a wharf or something there. Unlike every other picture in the tin, there's nothing on the back of this one.
Oh, mysterious.
Yeah, so I just call him the sultry Mountie.
I love
And
it.
it made me think about Cecil. I never met him. I started interviewing some family members, and they said, yeah, he never got married. We asked him why. He's like, well, there's no woman out there for me. True enough, maybe. But he also then looked after the kids, looked after the animals, looked after his mom until she died. We have no confirmation at all that he had sex with other men, that he was homosexual, that he was gay. We have no confirmation of anything except he was the bachelor uncle. He got along well with the kids. He cared for people. He performed some of those typically women's roles in the wider family of caregiving, of emotional support. Everyone liked him. No one asked any questions, because you don't do that on the prairie. And he died in the 70s, and no one knew much better. But his brother didn't take apart this collection when he inherited it, and left it intact. And there was apparently a string around it that just said Cecil's photo or Cecil's photos. And now I've inherited it, and I think there's something queer about Cecil in that broad sense. I'm not, like I said, this is one of those ones where you were asking, like, how definitively do you say it? Well, I didn't come across any pornography in here, so there's nothing that shows me anything of a sexual nature, but there's this kind of adding up of possibility. And then when I link that to the stories of his own life and the characterization of him by people that knew him and the kind of silences from other members of the family about him, it just starts to build up a picture of possibility. And I think that's enough. That's enough for me to include Cecil in queer history as part of this bigger range of possibilities. And it resonates for me. Like I then think, well, my cousin and I maybe aren't the only pink sheep in the family, and that we have some forebears.
All right, thank you. It's a lovely collection. And actually, Divine Mrs. M is just saying, was it directly left to you?
No, no,
I think she was wondering if that was a clue.
no. Well, it was the my cousin who is gay as well. Who is he's still alive. He hasn't willed it to me. He very generously gave it to me, knowing how interested I am in these histories.
Thank you for sharing that. So my last question is, um, and I'm not asking that just because this is queer history, because I ask it of quite a lot of histories, but I think this might be one where some people, especially maybe straight people, are thinking, well, what's that got to do with me as a family historian? And I was just wondering whether you could tell me why you think queer history is important, and perhaps especially to family historians.
Well, because we all have a wide range of people in our families, and I think to leave out their stories is to deny their validity in the present. And our families are incredibly diverse, and maybe in their own lives they weren't welcomed by family members, and maybe had to hide their lives. And there's something we can do now to recover some of those stories. But then the stories of our queer family members might not be just stories of oppression and repression and fear and danger, because lots of families accommodated and included and treasured queer family members in the past. And even if they didn't, even if they weren't legally recognized as couples, lots of families had members of their family that lived with members of the same sex, and that person was just accommodated within the family. People didn't make a fuss; they just got on with it and said, "Oh, yeah, Charles, he's been with his friend Bert for 30 years. They're really close." And no one would necessarily say, "Well, they're this, they're that." They would just say, "Yeah, they've been together. They've been living together." And they would be valued in that family. Children might know them both as uncle because they're older. I think there's lots and lots of stories to tell, because as much as the stories of persecution, prosecution, oppression are deeply important, deeply traumatic, but important parts of our history, they should never be the only histories that get told. And so often families, I think, are wrongly seen only as sites of abuse and pain for queer people. And that's not the case now, and it's not always the case in the present. Especially in the past. I mean, talk about the past. It's not only, it was such a good finish there that I was thinking about it too much as I was saying it. I'm
I
like,
think I knew what you meant anyway. It kind of,
yeah, yeah,
it
it's
kind of just
true in the
automatically
past for
translated it.
families as well.
Brilliant. Thank you. And where can people come and find you if they want to support queer history, or they want to just find out a bit more about you, or tweet you?
Yeah, no, I'm on various social media under my own name, Justin. There's my finger, Justin Bengry across the there. I'm on Twitter. I'm easily findable online. I'm at Goldsmiths at the University of London. We have an MA Queer History here as well. I suppose another reason for supporting queer history is that it's always under threat. I mean, this is something you and I were talking about earlier, Natalie, is that even here at Goldsmiths, we're undergoing right now a really painful restructure that's put the entire history department at risk. Every single member of staff, bar one, our head of department, has been served notice of risk of redundancy, myself and my colleague who teaches queer history as well. So that means 100% of people teaching queer history here at the only MA queer history in the world are at risk of redundancy. And we're going through this process now, waiting to find out whether our jobs will survive and whether this pioneering program will survive.
Oh, I certainly hope it does. And if you need me to retweet anything in support, then I quite happily will. And I'm sure lots of people watching will as well. So
Thank you so
thank you
much.
so much, Justin. I am going to hit the end broadcast button, and it will do this awkward thing where it takes a second to not be live. And then I'm sat there freeze framed going, But I will hit it anyway. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Lovely talking.